a list buried in a jar beneath an apple tree, names written in code, lives hidden in plain sight. One woman against the machinery of extermination. Subscribe if you love Jesus. The photograph shows an elderly woman, white-haired and frail, her face deeply lined by time and memory. She holds a candle, its small flame steady in her weathered hands. The image was taken in 2007, near the end of a life that spanned 98 years. Behind those eyes lies a story the world nearly forgot, a testimony buried as deliberately as the jars she once hid in the earth. The question her life poses is not whether heroism existed during the Holocaust. Thousands of such stories survive, but whether ordinary courage, sustained over years in the shadow of death, can be measured at all, or whether some acts of mercy exceed the vocabulary we have to describe them. Her name was Irena Sendler. Though she carried many names during the war years, many identities stitched together from forged documents and whispered agreements. She was born Irena Krzyżanowska on February 15, 1910, in Warsaw, Poland. Though she spent her early years in Otwock, a town southeast of the capital. Her father, Stanisław, was a physician who treated patients regardless of their ability to pay, including the poor Jewish families other doctors often refused. When a typhus epidemic struck in 1917, Stanisław continued treating Jewish patients even as the disease spread. He contracted typhus himself and died, leaving his 7-year-old daughter with a legacy more valuable than inheritance. The example of service without regard to cost. Poland between the wars was a fractured nation rebuilt from the ruins of partition, its independence fragile, its politics volatile. Warsaw was a vibrant city of literature, music, and intellectual ferment. It was also a city where anti-Semitism simmered in universities, newspapers, and political movements, though Jewish life flourished in neighborhoods like Muranov and Nalełki, where Yiddish mingled with Polish in the streets and synagogues stood alongside Catholic churches. Irena studied Polish literature at Warsaw University, where she joined socialist circles that advocated for social justice and opposed ethnic discrimination. When the university introduced a ghetto bench system in the 1930s, segregating Jewish students in lecture halls, Irena and other Polish students refused to comply. Standing with their Jewish classmates in protest, she married Mieczysław Sendler in 1931, though the marriage was troubled from the start. Her true commitment was to the work that consumed her: social welfare among Warsaw's poorest residents. By 1939, Irena was employed by the Warsaw Social Welfare Department, managing aid programs for impoverished families. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, and the nation collapsed in weeks under the weight of blitzkrieg and Soviet invasion from the east, Warsaw found itself under Nazi occupation. The city that had pulsed with life became a place of curfews, checkpoints, and arbitrary violence. In October 1940, the German authorities ordered the establishment of a Jewish ghetto in Warsaw. Over 350,000 Jews, roughly 30% of the city's population, were forced into an area covering barely 1.3 square miles. Walls were built, topped with barbed wire and broken glass. Guards were posted at the gates. The largest concentration of Jews in occupied Europe was sealed inside a prison without bars, where starvation, disease, and deportation would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. Irena's work in the social welfare department gave her access to the ghetto. The Nazis permitted limited aid operations, partly to maintain a facade of humanitarian concern, partly because they needed someone to manage the epidemic diseases that threatened to spread beyond the walls. Irena obtained a pass from the Epidemic Control Department, which allowed her to enter the ghetto to inspect sanitary conditions. She used this access to smuggle food, medicine, and money to Jewish families she had known before the war. But food and medicine could only delay the inevitable. The ghetto was a waiting room for death. By 1942, the deportations had begun. The Nazis called it resettlement. The destination was Treblinka, an extermination camp 60 miles northeast of Warsaw, where victims were murdered in gas chambers within hours of arrival. Trains left the ghetto carrying thousands of Jews each day. Within weeks, over 250,000 people had been transported to Treblinka and killed. Those who remained in the ghetto understood what resettlement meant. Parents faced an impossible calculation: keep their children with them and watch them die, or surrender them to strangers in the desperate hope they might survive. Irena joined Żegota, the Council to Aid Jews, a clandestine organization established by the Polish underground in late 1942. It was one of the only such networks in occupied Europe specifically dedicated to saving Jews, and it operated with the knowledge and support of the Polish government in exile in London. Within Żegota, Irena led the children's division. Her mission was to smuggle Jewish children out of the ghetto and place them with Polish families, convents, orphanages, anywhere they might have a chance to survive. The logistics were staggering. Each rescue required forged documents, safe houses, cooperative contacts on both sides of the ghetto wall, and enormous risk. Children had to be coached to forget their Jewish names, their prayers in Hebrew, their accents in Polish. Infants were sedated with sleeping drugs and hidden in toolboxes, sacks of potatoes, coffins carried out through the ghetto gates. Older children were led through sewers that reeked of waste and disease, crawling through darkness toward an uncertain future. Some escaped through the courthouse that bordered the ghetto, entering as visitors and leaving through the Polish side. Others were taken out in ambulances, hidden under stretchers or listed as typhus cases too contagious to examine closely. Irena worked with a network of couriers, most of them women, who moved through Warsaw carrying forged papers and coded messages. Among her closest collaborators were Irena Schultz, Jaga Piotrowska, and Jadwiga Deneka. Each understood the stakes. Discovery meant torture and execution, not only for themselves but for the families hiding children and the children themselves. The Gestapo showed no mercy to those who aided Jews. Public executions were common, bodies left hanging in the streets as warnings. Records compiled after the war suggest that Irena and her network succeeded in smuggling approximately 2,500 children out of the Warsaw Ghetto between 1940 and 1943. The exact number remains uncertain because documentation was deliberately fragmented to protect both the children and their rescuers. Irena kept meticulous records, writing each child's real name alongside their false identity, sealing the lists in glass jars, and burying them in the garden of her colleague, Jaga Piotrowska, beneath an apple tree. She intended to recover the lists after the war, so the children might reclaim their true identities and, if any relatives survived, be reunited with their families. The work exacted a moral cost that defied easy reckoning. Parents handed their children to Irena, knowing they would likely never see them again. Children left the ghetto not understanding why their mothers wept as they said goodbye, not grasping that goodbye meant forever. Some children were too young to remember their birth names or their parents' faces. Others never forgave the adults who had sent them away, even when they later understood the choice had been between probable death and possible life. On October 20th, 1943, the Gestapo arrested Irena. Someone had informed, though whether from malice, coercion, or inadvertent disclosure remains unclear, she was taken to Pawiak prison, the same facility that had held Maximilian Kolbe before his transfer to Auschwitz. For months, she was interrogated and tortured. The Nazis broke her legs and feet, left her with permanent injuries that troubled her the rest of her life. They demanded the names of the children, the locations of the families hiding them, the identities of her collaborators. She gave them nothing. Contemporary accounts from fellow prisoners describe her maintaining silence through sessions that left her unconscious, bleeding, barely able to walk. She was sentenced to death. The execution was scheduled. Then, on the eve of her execution date, a guard called her name and led her to a side corridor. She assumed she was being taken to be shot. Instead, the guard handed her a document and pushed her toward a door. She was free. Jagota had bribed a German officer, paying a sum that depleted much of their treasury. The official record listed her as executed, a fiction that allowed her to continue her work under a false identity for the remainder of the war. The Warsaw Uprising erupted in August 1944 as the Polish Home Army attempted to liberate the city before Soviet forces arrived. The battle lasted 63 days and ended in catastrophic defeat. The Nazis systematically destroyed Warsaw in retaliation, burning entire neighborhoods, executing tens of thousands of civilians, razing buildings block by block until 85% of the city lay in ruins. Irena survived in hiding, moving through the devastated city, tending to the few children still under her care, while Warsaw burned around her. When the war ended in May 1945, she retrieved the jars from beneath the apple tree. The lists were intact, though many of the names recorded there would never be reclaimed. Most of the children she had saved were orphans. Their parents had perished in Treblinka, Auschwitz, Majdanek, or in the ghetto itself. Of the 2,500 children saved, scholars estimate that fewer than 100 were ever reunited with surviving family members. Irena helped those she could locate, working to ensure they received support and, where possible, information about their origins. But post-war Poland was chaos. Borders had shifted. Populations were displaced. The communist government that took power viewed resistance organizations like Jagota with suspicion, seeing them as potential threats to the new order. The Soviet-backed regime preferred to suppress stories of the wartime underground, especially those involving collaboration between Poles and Jews that might complicate their narrative of history. Irena returned to social work, living quietly in Warsaw under the communist regime. She remarried, raised a family, and rarely spoke of the war years. The work she had done remained largely unknown beyond the small circle of survivors and collaborators who remembered. The communist authorities, when they acknowledged her at all, did so grudgingly. In 1965, Yad Vashem in Israel recognized her as righteous among the nations, an honor given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. But within Poland, official recognition was minimal, delayed by a government uncomfortable with stories that did not fit its preferred version of history. For decades, Irena Sendler lived in near obscurity, a woman whose name appeared in no textbooks, whose deeds were known to few. Then, in 1999, a group of high school students in Kansas, working on a history project, stumbled upon a brief mention of her in a footnote. They researched her story, wrote a play titled Life in a Jar, and performed it for audiences who had never heard her name. The play sparked interest. Media attention followed. Irena, by then in her late 80s, found herself thrust into the light. Journalists came to her small apartment in Warsaw. Survivors contacted her, thanking her for lives they had lived because of her courage. Governments and institutions that had ignored her for decades suddenly offered honors, medals, ceremonies. She was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, though she did not receive it. The recognition came late, almost too late, but it came She died on May 12, 2008, in Warsaw, at the age of 98. The children she saved scattered across the world. Some remained in Poland, living under adopted names, their Jewish heritage a secret they kept even from their own children. Others emigrated to Israel, the United States, Europe, carrying with them fragments of memory, a lullaby half-remembered, a face that might have been a mother, a name they once had but could no longer fully recall. A few returned to Warsaw in their old age, walking streets that bore no resemblance to the city they had fled, searching for the house where they had lived before the walls went up, before the lists were made, before their childhoods ended in the darkness of a sewer or the bed of a truck carrying potatoes. The significance of Irena Sendler's testimony extends beyond numbers, though 2,500 lives is itself a staggering total. Her story refutes the claim often made during and after the Holocaust that nothing could be done, that the machinery of genocide was too powerful, too efficient, too absolute to resist. She demonstrated that resistance was possible, that rescue was possible, that even within the darkest system, individuals retained the capacity to choose mercy over complicity. Scholars continue to study the networks that enabled her work, tracing the threads of cooperation between Polish Catholics, secular socialists, and the Jewish families they saved. The story complicates easy narratives about collaboration and resistance during the occupation. Poland suffered terribly under Nazi rule. Over 5 million Polish citizens died, half of them Jewish. The risks of aiding Jews were real and often fatal. Yet within that reality, thousands of Poles chose to help, forming a network of resistance that saved lives even as the state apparatus of genocide ground forward. Irena herself resisted the label of hero. In interviews late in her life, she insisted she had done what was necessary, that her courage was ordinary, that the true heroes were the parents who gave up their children and the children who survived the loss of everything they had known. She spoke of guilt more often than pride, haunted by the children she could not save, the names she could not reach, the faces that appeared in her dreams for 60 years after the war ended. The jars buried beneath the apple tree symbolize something essential about the nature of witness. The names written on those fragile slips of paper represented an act of faith, faith that the war would end, that truth would matter again, that memory could be recovered even from the earth. The lists were a refusal to let the murdered be erased, a testimony inscribed in code and buried against the day when the world might care enough to dig them up. That day came, though it came late and incomplete. Most of the children whose names were recorded in those jars never learned their original identities. Most died without knowing who their parents had been, what language their mothers sang to them, what prayers their fathers taught. The Holocaust did not only kill bodies, it killed lineages, languages, communities, memory itself. Rescue saved lives but could not restore what was lost. Yet the lives saved mattered absolutely. Each child who survived grew into an adult, bore children of their own, became the root of a family tree that would otherwise have been cut down. Scholars estimate that the descendants of those 2,500 children now number in the tens of thousands. They live in cities across the world, most of them unaware they owe their existence to a woman with a forged pass and a list buried in a jar, to a network of strangers who chose risk over safety, mercy over fear. The question Irena Sendler's life poses is not whether we would have done the same. Most of us cannot know until the choice is before us. The question is whether we recognize the structure of that choice when it appears in smaller forms, in the daily decisions to see suffering or look away, to act or remain passive, to risk inconvenience or worse for the sake of another whose name we may not even know. The machinery of evil operates through the cooperation or indifference of ordinary people. It requires bureaucrats to process paperwork, neighbors to report suspicious activity, citizens to accept explanations that allow them to sleep at night. Resistance begins when individuals refuse their assigned role, when they falsify a document, hide a child, tell a lie that saves a life. Such acts do not dismantle the machinery, but they throw sand in the gears. They save whom they can save. Irena Sendler threw sand in the gears for years. She saved 2,500 lives, one child at a time, through sewers and ambulances and coffins, through forged papers and whispered instructions and desperate prayers. The light she kindled in that darkness still burns in the lives of those children's descendants, in the testimony of survivors, in the jars dug from the earth and the lists recovered from the past. The apple tree is gone. The garden where the jars were buried has been built over. But the names endure, entered now in the archives of Yad Vashem, preserved in testimonies and histories, spoken aloud in ceremonies that honor the dead and celebrate the living. 2,500 names, each one a world, each one rescued from the abyss by a woman who insisted she was ordinary, who claimed no special courage, who simply did what needed doing when the moment demanded, and the cost was her own safety, her own body, her own peace. Memory is the final resistance against oblivion, and Irena Sendler's story is memory incarnate. Buried in jars, recovered from earth, carried forward by those who refuse to forget, the witness she bore endures in every child who lived because she came, in every generation descended from that salvation, in the quiet testimony that love, however fragile, however outmatched, can stand against the machine and save whom it saves, one name at a time, one life redeemed from ash and silence.